but also a large personal following of patients. And he was a very high-profile, very public figure. And without that sort of personality, the type of thing which happened at Chelmsford would not have happened. For it to have happened, you had to have a person in control there in whom other people really believed.
Dr. John Heron was a staunch believer in Bailey. Almost from the beginning of Bailey's regime at Chelmsford, Dr. Heron was closely involved as his deputy. During the 70s, Dr. Ian Gardner was contracted by Dr. Heron to administer electric shock treatment at Chelmsford. Dr. John Gill was part owner of Chelmsford. He was a successful property dealer as well as a physician. Of the 100 or so nurses who spent time at Chelmsford during the 15 years of deep sleep treatment, very few are willing to talk today. Marcia Fordry is an exception.
Dr. Bailey was very adamant in relation to the depth of the sleep that his patients were kept at. He believed that the deeper they were, the more effective the treatment was. So he had the nurses believing that if they didn't keep them deep, they wouldn't get better. You know, it was almost like it'll be your fault, be it on your head if they start waking up and it doesn't work.
You walk into his office, it's very opulent. There's the fish tank full of tropical fish and the plush carpets. And he wears these sort of fancy brocade jackets. He's quite, you know, expect him to be the sort of debonair type that smokes a cigar. Is very nice and very charming. And a lot of people have fallen for that charm. And, of course, I was only very young. And I went into his office, and the first thing I saw was a human brain on his desk in formaldehyde or whatever they put it in. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Oh, that's the brain of a criminal I once operated on."
Harry was very charismatic. He was an academic. He was interested in so many things. He was trying to learn Chinese. He played not a bad flute. He was into electronics. He did all the gimmicky electronic things that he had in his home, like, you know, you clap your hands and the lights go on and all that sort of stuff. He was always into something. He was a man that was forever, ever busy. I considered him then, when I knew him, as an absolute genius.
I think a lot of the stuff that he did was experimental, in a sense, even though he had this belief that it worked. I asked him to come and talk to the nurses because I didn't know what to say. And I went to that lecture, and I actually taped that lecture for nurses that weren't able to come. And I mean, he was so convincing. He really did believe in it.
We are in an age now where we've got some very beautiful chemicals that will allow us to produce very stylish results in people's mental function. We never had those in those.
But what was the effect of the kind of chemical doses that Bailey favoured?
In my view, there would be very little doubt that they would be very severely sedated, perhaps in extremes to the point of being unrousable. I think when, say, an hour or so after receiving a very large oral dose of barbiturates, the level in the blood and therefore the level in the brain would build up to the point where they might well be not really asleep, but in quite a deep coma.
Bailey, the showbiz psychiatrist, also had showbiz patients. In the late 60s, one of Australia's most successful TV stars was Bobby Lynn.
My wife was doing another television show, and I was home alone, and I was watching my show, actually, on television, and I suddenly felt this great depression and this pain in my tummy, and I felt very depressed, and I just sort of almost ran outside, out in the garden. We had rather a large rose garden, and I laid on my back under the rose garden, under the rose bushes, and a rose petal dropped out of one of the bushes, and that to me was the key. It sent me off, and I just couldn't stop crying and weeping. And anyway, the next day, I was taken off to see Harry Bailey. He told me that he had to stop my mind. In other words, he likened it to a motor car. You have to stop the engine before you can repair it. So he said, I'm going to send your mind on a holiday for about a fortnight. And they call it deep sleep therapy, you see. So I went along. I went to the hospital and with my wife and my daughter. They saw me into the hospital. I went into the bed, and then soon after I'd been there, he came in with the matron and wheeling something which he said, now it's time for my cocktail. And he turned me over and injected whatever it was. And I went into a very deep sleep, a coma, and there's only just brief snatches of things that I remember over the next 2 weeks. In going to the toilet, when you're in this stage, you've just come to enough, and the nursing sister would take you through to the bathroom, but you couldn't stand up, and I had to slide along the wall. I'll never forget that. Slide along the wall, and in doing that, you had to pass this double door with the main sort of ward of Chelmsford. And I'll never forget looking in there, because it not only was quite dark, but it smelt, and there were these bodies on the bed, like some rare, some of them not really clothed properly,
Unlike Bailey's star patients, the experience of Pat Lloyd was much more typical of the majority of patients who went into Chelmsford, with few prior health checks, inadequate explanation of the treatment to follow, and consent rarely obtained from them. Pat emigrated from England in 1964 with her husband and 4 children.
When I came, I was very homesick. I felt, I wanted to go back as soon as I came. So, of course, that didn't help my husband, who was trying to settle in a job, and I suppose I was nagging.
Pat became depressed, and she was persuaded to consult Dr. Bailey by her husband.
And then he announced that he was going to sell the unit we were living in, and I kind of panicked about that. And he went out of the room, went next door to the neighbour, and while he was gone, I drank some whiskey, which knocked me out, because when he came back, I was unconscious, and he rang Harry Bailey up. This ambulance turned up. I know Harry Bailey was there. And I was just taken off to Chelmsford, and my husband didn't even know where the hospital was. So that was it. I was gone, and I was gone for 3 weeks. I woke up in this room with all these, there was men there, and about 6 beds, I think. I had no clothes on. And I remember being tied down, having... I don't like talking about it.
Does it make you angry when you think about it?
Yes, it does. Because it was such a... it took all your dignity away from you. I'm terribly sorry. Really, but it happens every time. I mean, I should be used to it now, talking about it. But it was just that room. I mean, it was horror, and the fact, they were all moaning and groaning, and I had something down my throat. And it was Listerine, and I remember Listerine